From what I've heard, Tony Abbott is not Australia's most popular Prime Minister, and say what you want about him, but I do support one of his contributions to the country called Operation Sovereign Borders. I've mentioned this military engagement on my channel a couple of times before, but to mention it again, it is a policy where the Australian military patrols the water surrounding the country and intercept boats that try to illegally enter it, and they either sink them or detain them and put them in detention centers near the coast. This has also garnered support amongst the public with the slogan, "No way you will not make Australia your home."
It is the policy and practice of the Australian government to intercept any vessel that is seeking to illegally enter Australia and safely remove it beyond our waters. If you travel by boat without a visa, you will not make Australia home.
The engagement has become controversial worldwide as many human rights activists slam the decision. So far here on YouTube, only Now This and AJ Plus have spoken out against them. However, I found another channel that has criticized the Abbott government's decision while bringing up some dodgy claims. So here's my response.
Hello everyone, today I wanted to talk about a subject I've seen picked up among the right wing in foreign countries, and I figured for once, something political in my own country is gaining interest overseas, so it might be worth talking about. I also apologise for the tone of my latest videos being a little bit somber, but it's kind of hard to figure out how to put a positive spin on these subjects because they are pretty heavy subjects. So I apologise if it's been a little bit dry lately. Peter Dutton is a member of the right-wing party in Australia who recently suggested that we issue visas to white South African farmers. As a short note on that, that was actually rejected by the government, so, that's not even going to happen.
Well, that's too bad.
But anyway, I've seen these comments widely celebrated on the right and especially the far right overseas, and of course there would be some liberals celebrating these comments as well. I've also seen people taking examples of some of the outrage that these comments have generated, and they're using this as some sort of evidence of a hatred against white people. So, it should go without saying, I am white, I don't have a hatred of white people. There are many benefits to taking these people in, so what is the problem here? Well, to understand these problems, you need a little bit of context about Australia. I really have no idea how much the average foreigner knows about Australian history, so I'll just assume you're working with no knowledge at all about it, so I apologise if you do actually know what I'm talking about here.
Well, I myself love history, and having dual citizenship inspired me to learn more about other Western nations. Australia is no exception, but I'll let you speak.
The original inhabitants of Australia were the Aboriginal people. These weren't a homogenous group of people the way we tend to think of it, as it was more kind of like Europe without distinct land borders, because they didn't culturally have a concept of ownership of the land. But these groups were culturally and linguistically distinct groups all over Australia. When the British arrived here, there were multiple genocides carried out over years, some of which are arguably still a problem today, though officially it all ended in 1972. I say arguably for a whole host of reasons, but I don't really want to talk about that for too long in this video, considering it really does deserve its own video. The Aboriginal people weren't even considered humans under law, and Australia has a very hostile history when it comes to non-white people. There's also the very famous policy from the early 1900s that used to be enacted called the White Australia policy, which would prohibit non-white immigration to Australia. So already perhaps you can see the poor optics of rolling out the red carpet specifically for white refugees if you're at all familiar with our position on taking refugees as a country. To talk briefly about the genocides of Aboriginal people that have taken place, I'll have to be reductionist because there have been a huge number of attempts to genocide the Aboriginal people, with many being successful attempts. As an example, Tasmanian Aboriginals are thought to be completely genocided after what's called the Black War. Another genocide is known as the Stolen Generation, where the government stole children from Aboriginal families, given the lighter-skinned children to white families, some of whom had literally no idea that they were even Aboriginal. When I speak about this, you're probably thinking that this was something that was done a very long time ago, right? Wrong. It finished in 1972 officially, and there are still claims that this is still going on today, which do seem quite credible.
Hang on, really? Even though it's been made illegal, along with the Australian government giving them their own land, certain benefits, and implementing National Sorry Day?
Now, because this is YouTube, I am sure somebody will get mad at me for portraying Australia as racist and something, and they'll contest something that's generally not even contested by anybody except for this idiot. And, you know, honestly, to those of you who want to do that, I'm really not interested in debating you, because I see this done a lot on the right wing where they try and downplay things like slavery or genocide attempts that white people have carried out. And I honestly have no interest in debating whether or not those things happened, because it is accepted as fact. This is historical fact. You cannot credibly debate whether or not this happened. It happened, and I really just don't have the patience to argue with people who don't think that historical facts actually took place.
Okay, no one is denying that white people committed genocide or had slaves, at least not the vast majority of people. Hell, I'm Canadian, and I know of all the violence that the First Nations had to go through. I mean, I don't deny it, it was bad, it was wrong. But what we don't like is when social justice warriors and liberals hypocritically demonize white people as the root of all evil, who are the only ones who ever committed genocide.
The white race is the most violent and oppressive force of nature on Earth.
Non-white people have made their attempts at colonizing or conquering Western nations such as the Persians, Carthage, the Islamic Empire, by many North African kingdoms including the Moors and Nubians, by the Huns, by the Mongols. I mean, the Mongols brought the Black Death to Europe by catapulting plagued bodies over the walls of Crimea. We've also resisted conquest by the Ottomans, by the Mexicans with the start of the siege of Fort Texas, even by the Japanese, who had the same ambitions as Nazi Germany. Did you know that they even attacked Australia, with examples being the bombing of Darwin and the attack on Sydney Harbour? Those attacks took a large toll on our people, but we managed to rebuild ourselves from the ground up. All regions of this earth have skeletons in their closet, and the only difference between these people and these people is that this group didn't succeed in taking over this group. They didn't fail because they didn't want to. They failed because they couldn't. However, liberals will completely ignore this part. They get pissed when we can't tell the difference between a Western African and an Eastern African, and yet they can't tell the difference between a Nordic European and a Mediterranean European. Regarding slavery, it was practiced on every continent, so I'm not going to go into detail there.
To bring things to modern times, in 2013 Tony Abbott was elected Prime Minister, and his key campaign slogan was "Stop the Boats." This, of course, being referenced to refugees to this country, who the right wing will often call economic migrants.
By definition, a refugee is a person who has been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, persecution, or a natural disaster. The boats that attempt to enter Australia are mostly from the impoverished nations in Southeast Asia, none of which are experiencing war or natural disasters. The closest thing to an armed conflict in Southeast Asia is in Thailand, where numerous coups are made. However, they are bloodless many times and are recognized by the royal family as long as they're successful. It is also worth noting that Thailand has the fourth largest GDP per capita in the region, because of its computer and information industry, so there's not really a big need to emigrate from that region. In regards to refugees from Syria, the Middle East, and then all over North Africa, look, the Dublin regulation explains the part of a third country. It says that a refugee must apply for asylum in the first nation that they arrive, where they are safe. They cannot start choosing between Turkey and Europe or Canada or Australia. They have to settle and apply for asylum where they are safe when they arrive. Okay, why can't the Gulf states? These are incredibly wealthy nations, and they have a very similar culture to these refugees. Why can't they grant asylum to them?
Boats tend to be intercepted, and people are kept in offshore detainment facilities on Nauru or Kangaroo Island. The treatment of refugees in these camps has been appalling, so much so that I genuinely will refer to them as concentration camps, unironically, because honestly, it's about that bad. Under the Abbott government, the Liberal and National Party, which by the way are right-wing parties that team up to have the House majority, they passed a bill which would essentially make it illegal for medical workers in our refugee camps to report abuse of the detainees being taken out.
Whoa, calling it a concentration camp is a bit of a stretch, don't you think? These are detention centers, not places where they exterminate people. May I also remind you that your own sources state that these detainees start throwing things at the guards and attacking them. which then escalates. Look, I'm not saying that they're treating them politely, and it is wrong. But this is a full-blown riot where a lot of things can happen. About that bill where you said where the government was making it illegal to report abuse, I can't find that source anywhere. Not in your links, not in my research. The closest thing I could find was an Al Jazeera article that talks about accusing Australia of denying medical care to the migrants, and Al Jazeera has always had some pretty questionable sources.
Essentially, this almost makes it legal to abuse the refugees in whatever way you like, because, considering now no one can actually report if this is happening. Regardless of these laws, some brave doctors have been speaking out despite this and risk their freedom to do so, and I've really got the utmost respect for them to do this, because I was appalled when these laws came to be. I was also appalled by the lack of coverage this got in our media, and also by the lack of fucks given by the general Australian populace. Something I want to mention here, in case it isn't obvious already from the direction of the video: the majority of these refugees in these camps aren't white. The refugees who were born in these camps and have lived there their entire lives, basically being imprisoned indefinitely. This is a huge part of why there is backlash for Peter Dutton suggesting that we roll out the red carpet for white refugees. It's not that there's anything inherently wrong with that, but it's that in contrast with the dehumanising conditions we're keeping refugees in currently, most of whom aren't white, it does show a racist bias, especially considering Peter Dutton was one of those who was elected around the Abbott government and part of his political party. A big part of what got Peter Dutton in office was this rhetoric surrounding keeping refugees out of the country, and so for him to turn around now and be pro-refugee but in very, very selective circumstances where they happen to be white, that is incredibly telling.
As I said earlier, many of these people are not fleeing conflicts, nor have they been forced to leave their homes, and many that have been are traveling way too far. The majority are migrants seeking a better life. However, this is Australian soil, and they have the right to decide who they will let into the country. Now, when it comes to South Africa, the people who really are in danger, I wouldn't put Australia at the top of that list. Instead, I would put them in the neighboring African nations, but there's a clear distinction between this and this.
The people calling this racist aren't saying this in isolation, and they're not being hysterical. This genuinely takes more of an understanding of what political stuff is happening in Australia than the average American has, or Canadian, or whatever, and let's face it, probably a lot of Australians too. So no, there's nothing inherently wrong with taking refugees from South Africa. The point of my video isn't to say that we shouldn't take them. In fact, I do think it would be nice if we did help these people. It's hard to know what's really happening here because a lot of the people covering it do seem to be, I don't know, like Lauren Southern. I don't really trust her to report on anything in an objective way because she obviously is pushing an agenda. But it does seem like there are bad things happening there. So I'm not opposed to helping these people, but I also think that we should be helping all refugees, regardless of where they're from or what their skin colour is.
That's a lovely thought, but we cannot be the cradle for every refugee in the world. The Dublin regulation applies to these individuals too, and other countries, ones that are easier places that the refugees can assimilate to, must accept them as well. I do not believe in emptying out the third world and relocating them here in the West, and anyone who supports that idea has a bigger agenda than just helping refugees. That's why I support Australia's border protection program, and I'm glad that here in Europe, where I live, we have something similar in the Mediterranean called Operation Triton, as well as the U.S. National Guard being deployed to the U.S.-Mexico border. Illegal immigrations are a financial drain to a host country. That's true of all kinds to all places, and it's even more terrifying when they're threatening war if we don't open the floodgates. Which is why I stick to what I've said earlier on this channel. Instead of our troops fighting wars in the Middle East, they should be on armed patrol on our borders.